All right, we're going to go ahead and get started this evening. Thank you for coming back. Sandra Watson just made a fun passing reference to Paul and the thorn in his side. I've been a little bit surprised that this question hasn't come up yet. No one's asked, well, do we know what the thorn in Paul's side is? He references this in 2 Corinthians. He's talking about just the various hardships that he's faced in 2 Corinthians. The question is, well, if you're really used by God, if you're called by God to be an apostle, Paul, why are you having all these hardships? And he goes through and he recounts his various hardships. And he talks about, and it's a whole list of things, many of which we don't see show up in the book of Acts. Another reminder to us that Luke's not writing a full, exhaustive history of Paul's life. But then Paul says, I'm experienced all these things, but I also, and he uses second or third person language, he says, I'm not going to boast, but I would boast about a person who was called up to heaven and saw great and glorious things which words are not able to express, or which I'm not permitted to express. He's talking about himself, and he had a vision that God allowed him to have of heaven. And he goes on to say that because of being given this vision, that God also allowed him a thorn in his side. A messenger of Satan is what he uses to describe it, in order that he might not be arrogant, might not be prideful. So there's been all kinds of speculation. One speculation was it might be that Paul had problems with his eyes, ongoing problems. Remember, he was blinded when he was on the road to Damascus. He makes a reference in Galatians 1 or 2, Galatians 1 or 2, about the Galatians. They loved him so much they would have torn out their eyes and given them to him. But some people are thinking that might be an indicator of it. That's probably not, it could be the case with his eyes, but that in particular, that Galatian reference is a fairly common idiom just to say that they would do whatever was needed to help him out. So it may be reading too much into that. However, so here's the big news. There's been a big find. There's been a big document find that really opens it up in ways we've never seen before. And so I think we finally understand what Paul's thorn in his flesh is. Okay. There's Paul writing, and there is SpongeBob chained next to him. Hey, Paul, what are you doing? Writing a letter, Paul? And if ever there was a messenger from Satan, that would be it. And if you want to throw... That was cruel, wasn't it? That's pretty terrible.
You didn't know that was going to be a joke?
I know. I'm sorry.
He said new revelation.
It's a new revelation. There it is. It's significant. So I haven't submitted this yet to the Society of Biblical Literature, but we'll see. All right. So I'll try to be better. I know. I'll do penance and all that. So okay. So quick review of Paul's life. We've looked at the various missionary journeys. The first missionary journey, remember, he and Barnabas go out from Antioch. They go to Cyprus, and then they go up into the Galatian churches. That's where they share the gospel. They establish churches there, and then they return. The second missionary journey, after Paul and Barnabas have disagreed and split and gone their separate ways, Paul takes Silas, and he goes up by land back to the Galatian churches, and then God redirects him. Remember, he was trying to go to the province of Asia where Ephesus was. And then the Spirit wouldn't allow him. He's redirected to Troas, where he has the vision of a man from Macedonia in Greece. And he goes over to Greece and shares the gospel, making his way down to Corinth. And he spends about 1.5 years there at Corinth before he comes back over, stopping at Ephesus on his way back down to Caesarea and then up to Antioch. So that's his second missionary journey. And then last week we saw his third missionary journey, where again he goes overland through the Galatian churches and spends time at Ephesus. And we saw that he was there at Ephesus for 3 years, or for the better part of 3 years. And that's where Paul, it's the longest stay of his missionary journeys. We mentioned that it is a current trend in New Testament scholarship to project or to theorize that there was an imprisonment of Paul here while he's in Ephesus. We don't have the textual backing from that. Nothing in Acts tells us that happened, but it does make a lot of sense. We see some of the trouble he gets into at the end of his time in Ephesus, and we see it makes a lot of logistical sense out of some of the prison letters, Ephesians, Colossians, and Philemon in particular. He goes from Ephesus, he makes his way around down to Greece, makes his way down to Corinth, stays there for about 3 months, then makes his way back around the coast there before heading toward Jerusalem. The whole time on this trip, he's taking up a collection for the poor in Jerusalem. And he mentions this in a couple of his letters, but he gets into the most detail of it in 2 Corinthians 8 and 9. And he's talking about, this is a collection for all of the Gentiles to give to the Jewish church, the church in Jerusalem in particular, at a time of famine. And he explains it. He says, the desire is that not that you would give and become poor, but that out of your plenty, their needs would be met. And he also is pointing out something that's important. They've received the gospel from the church at Jerusalem. That's the mother church, if you will, where where the gospel first began to spread out. And he's playing off some prophecies from Isaiah, and I didn't jot down the exact reference, but in the latter chapters of Isaiah 40 on to about 60, you see this idea where the prophetic word is that the Gentiles are going to be reached. God's promise to Abraham to bless all the nations of the world through the people of Israel was going to come about through the gospel. And as a result of that, Isaiah prophesies that the Gentiles will come and will bring their treasures. They will pay homage to the Jewish people in reverence and in appreciation for what they've received through the gospel. And so Paul is actually acting that out by initiating this collection to come and to bring it to Jerusalem. And again, I do apologize for not having that reference down. I will make sure to have it for us next week, because I think it's a significant point that is it's there in the background of the whole story, and Paul alludes to that principle in 2 Corinthians, but it's not spelled out quite as much that I think it was in his mind anyway. I think it really factored into his motivations for why he's doing it. Yes, to help a church in need, but there's a theological bent there to say we are the beneficiaries of our spiritual fathers, the Jewish people through whom the gospel has come. And now we want to give back as a way of saying thanks, but also for Paul on a very practical level, it's a way of fostering the unity in the church between Jew and Gentiles. Remember, this is still an ongoing conflict of having Jewish and Gentile Christ followers be one. This is a cross-cultural ministry, and those can get sticky, right? So Paul is looking at the collection as a way to bridge some of the gap there between them culturally. And what better way to demonstrate love than to meet their needs? And so I think Paul really has an intense, he has a high hopes for this collection and how it might be used, not just to meet physical needs, but to strengthen the entire church. So that's what we see going on. Before we get into the passage, I did want to do a quick bit of background work, and this won't be as extensive as the previous weeks, but I wanted to take a look from another first century text. This is from the writer Josephus. Now, many of you will know Josephus was a Jewish historian who, during the Jewish war in the mid to late 60s, he actually defected to Rome. So he was a traitor of sorts, but he still holds on to his Jewish heritage in a lot of ways. And so he becomes a historian for Rome on all things Jewish. And so he writes, he's supported by the emperor, and he writes about the Jewish history and about the Jewish war in particular. And then later, he writes what is titled The Antiquities of the Jews, which is a long summary of Jewish life. The Wars of the Jews, he writes first. It's about 75 AD is when it's written. So maybe about 10 years after Paul's death, 4 years before Pompeii. We've seen those pictures. And he gives us a lot of insight into what was Judaism like in the first century. Again, remember, after Jerusalem is destroyed, Judaism changes. And what we see written in the Mishnah is from 200 AD. It's 150 years later. So there's a lot of doubt as to how much we can trust the Mishnah's insight into the first century. A lot of things that it says may not necessarily be grounded in historical fact. Josephus, however, is a really good source. And I'll say, if you're into the history, you can get a lot of Josephus just online. You can look him up, and you can look for specific things. If you want to look for his account of the destruction of Jerusalem, you can go and find that for free online and read it. And it's fascinating. And it really helps you to see a lot of, for instance, Matthew 24, when Jesus is talking about the end will come, when things are going down, go back and read what Josephus says about that time, and you'll see how much Jesus, his prophecy in 30 AD, how much it matched up with what came about there in about 70 AD. It's amazing. Well, Josephus tells us a little bit about the different groups, the different political groups within Judaism. He says, for there are 3 philosophical sects among the Jews. Remember, Judaism would be viewed as a philosophy, not a religion. It's a whole world view. He says the followers of the first are the Pharisees, of the second, the Sadducees, and the third sect, who pretends to be a severer discipline, is called the Essenes. We think we're pretty confident that the Dead Sea Scrolls are from a group of Essenes.
Spell it.
Essenes, Esssenes. Now, he talks a lot about the Essenes in the Jewish war, which makes it really interesting when we found the Dead Sea Scrolls back in 47 through 54, or 1947 to 1954. That's when the Dead Sea Scrolls were uncovered. It really verified how trustworthy Josephus is in a lot of things. Before that, it's kind of like, well, he says this, but, sometimes he's kind of a blowhard. We don't know if we can really trust him. The Dead Sea Scrolls prove that he may be a blowhard in a lot of ways. When he's talking about himself, he is not modest by any means. He's pretty proud of himself and his virtues and even why he defected. But he's pretty trustworthy in a lot of ways. Listen to what he says about the Pharisees. But then as to the 2 other orders first mentioned, the Pharisees are those who are most esteemed skillful in the exact explication of their laws and introduce the first sect. So high value for how they interpret the laws. They ascribe all to fate or providence and to God, and yet they allow that to act what is right or the contrary, what is wrong, is principally in the power of men, although fate does cooperate in every action. So they think God is at work in determining things, but people also have free will. So if you've heard we have the ongoing argument to our day. If you're a Calvinist or you believe in strict, everything is predetermined, so that God planned that I would hit that table and everything in between. That's one end of things. And then you have some people that say, no, God's not in those details. God doesn't plan it all. It's strictly up to us. The Pharisees are in the middle saying, yes, God is at work. God plans out the future. And yet he also allows people the freedom to choose, the freedom to act and to will. And so they're a middle of the road, a balanced viewpoint. The Pharisees say that all souls are incorruptible, but that the souls of good men are only removed into other bodies, but that the souls of bad men are subject to eternal punishment. This is really significant. So he's using Greek language, but he's saying here they believe in resurrection. They believe that one day good people will be resurrected bodily. That is, those who are faithful to God will be resurrected bodily, have resurrected bodies, not just like have a soul that goes up and sits on a cloud forever. That's Greek thought. They're seeing a bodily resurrection like what we see with Jesus, like what happened. But they think those who are deemed bad, their souls are punished, have eternal punishment. There's some debate. Does that mean like what we would commonly view hell, or would it be more like an annihilationism where their souls go to lake of fire and are burned up and cease to exist? There's views on both sides, and there's good arguments on both sides of that. The key point is they believe in resurrection. Now, the Sadducees. These are those that compose the second order, and they take away fate entirely and suppose that God is not concerned in our doing or not doing what is evil. So they say God is letting us run the show. He's sitting back and saying, how's it going to happen? It's up to you. They say that to do what is good or what is evil is at men's own choice, and that the one or other belongs to everyone, that they may act as they please. So we can choose what we want to do. They also take away the belief of the immortal duration of the soul and the punishments and rewards in Hades. In other words, they don't believe in resurrection, for good or bad. They believe in life and death. Now he says, moreover, the Pharisees are friendly to one another, and they exercise good concord and regard for each other in the public. But the behavior of the Sadducees toward one another is in some degree wild, and their conversation with those that are of their own party is as barbarous as if they were strangers to them. In other words, their own meetings just get crazy. They like to fight. And they like to argue. So anyway, you see some of the differences here between these two groups. Now what he says elsewhere is that the Sadducees, these are the ones who are the elites. They're wealthy. They have connections with the rich. They're the ones that hold the high priesthood. Caiaphas and his family, Annas, they're Sadducees. The high priesthood from this point forward, and I don't recall when it went to the Sadducees, but from this point forward until the temple is destroyed, it's Sadducees that are holding the high priesthood. And they're playing the politics game to get appointed by Rome. Rome is appointing the high priest. And so they're playing the political game very much. That's the Sadducees' role. Now, they also try to appease the population. So Josephus says sometimes they try to act like Pharisees. because if they didn't, he said, the whole populace wouldn't put up with them because they're so unliked. The Pharisees are popular. It's the Sadducees that are unpopular as the elites, as the hard-nosed, just difficult in many ways. So all of this is to say, it gives us a little bit of a different view on the Pharisees in particular. The Pharisees were respected among the people, and while they held tightly to the law, they also worked to explain the law in ways that people could live it out. Now, we're going to see in a little bit why these 5 or 10 minutes or so are worthwhile. But what questions do you have?
Are those still held beliefs today?
I don't know much about current Judaism because it's changed so much since the first century, since the destruction of the temple, and by the time you get to the Mishnah, it's really different. Now, just to kind of flesh it out, it's generally thought now that the Mishnah, it's written by the rabbis. The idea that many people have is that the rabbis kind of come from, or the ancestors, or the successors of the Pharisees. So they see, all right, because the Mishnah has nothing good to say about the Sadducees, just about. And so they think there's a lot of parallels from the Mishnah to what the Pharisees believed. There's probably some truth to that, but again, it's so late, you have to be a little skeptical. So an Orthodox Jew is going to look to the Mishnah or to the Talmud for some amount of guidance. How much, I really shouldn't say. If they're not Orthodox, I don't even know. I've heard in kind of interfaith conversations, a non-Orthodox Jew, and it sounds it doesn't sound very Jewish at all from a biblical standpoint. So I don't know.
So a Sadducee would not have even been looking for Messiah to come, probably.
That's not bad. They would, if a Sadducee was looking for a Messiah, it would be a king to establish a good kingdom now. Yeah.
Because pretty much to them, this religion was political and what I could get out of it just here, since there's nothing more than just what's here now.
Yeah, and that's not that uncommon for their time. And it kind of wigs us out to think about this, or at least it's different for us. But resurrection is not overly taught. It's not taught in the first 5 books of the law. It's just not there. You see it in Daniel. You see it, allusions to resurrection in Ecclesiastes and a few other points. It doesn't show up as much in the Old Testament. Not to say it's not there, but for them, they emphasize the first 5 books. They weren't even, they would read the prophets, but for them it didn't play as much as the Torah did. So yeah, they're looking for a king like David to come and set up an earthly kingdom. And to them, that's how God would keep his promises to them, to their children. Now, we might think of them as some wild liberal because they're not believing in the resurrection. Actually, they were the more conservative because they're not looking to a lot of things, quote unquote, extra or new to their tradition. So yeah, they had their arguments with Jesus, but there's a reason why Jesus, you see him interacting with the Pharisees more, because they're actually closer to each other. And that's one of the unique things in the world. A lot of times, it's not the ones that you disagree with the most that you have the hardest time getting along with. It's the one that you're actually closer to, but you disagree on some key points. That's where the things really get tough, right? So that's a helpful thing to think about with Jesus. But yeah, they're not looking for a resurrected king by any means. Any others?
What was the belief of the third group
The Essenes. All right. They're not going to factor in, so I'll just say it. The Essenes absolutely believe in total fate. So Sadducees don't believe. They think it's all up to us. The Pharisees think God has ordained things and yet gives us free will. The Essenes think God's written the story and we're playing it out. They do believe in resurrection. They in some ways are not far off from Pharisees in some of these key beliefs that we've talked about. They look for two messiahs. In many of the writings, at least, there's an idea that there's going to be a kingly Messiah who comes in, wipes out the competition, establishes a good kingdom, and then turns it over to a priestly Messiah who then leads the people to relate to God now that the whole world is under the one kingship. So they're interesting. Josephus has a lot to say about the Essenes. So, all right, let me go ahead and dive in. We do want to get into Paul. So Paul goes on toward Jerusalem. He landed at Tyre. If you want to follow in your Bible, we're in chapter Acts 21. While he's at Tyre, the believers there urged him not to go on to Jerusalem. They say things are not going to go well for you there, Paul. You really should stay away. He resists. He goes on. He goes to Caesarea Maritima, Caesarea by the sea there on the coast. You can see it down here. And he sees Philip. Remember Philip from earlier in the book of Acts, Philip who had shared the gospel with the Ethiopian. Paul spends some time there, and while he's there, a prophet named Agabus comes to Paul and warns Paul not to go to Jerusalem or he would be arrested. This is one of the great stories. Y'all know I like to use props. Well, Agabus uses props. He comes, takes Paul's belt off of him, ties his hands and feet, and lays down like a calf and says, "This is what's going to happen to the owner of the belt if he goes to Jerusalem." Hint, hint. Here's the visual. And Paul refused, and his refusal is really powerful. It's really compelling. He says, "I'm willing to go, not just to be arrested, but to die." Now, the way that Luke is setting all this up, it really seems as though Luke thinks Paul shouldn't have gone. That Luke thinks the Lord may be leading Paul not to go. Because you see over and over again, you see, first of all, a prophet whose word will ultimately come true. Paul will be arrested. You see the brothers and sisters over and over again telling Paul, warning Paul. And then in Acts 21, verse 14, this is Luke writing, he said, "When he would not be dissuaded, we gave up and said, 'The Lord's will be done.'" I think that's what Luke is saying here. He doesn't think the Lord's leading him to go. But Paul wants to see this collection finished. And it wouldn't even surprise me. I would say if you press me, I would think, yeah, Paul maybe is running, maybe he's letting ambition drive him in order to see to the end this gift, this collection, to heal the division between Jew and Gentile, or to take a step toward that. Now, you don't have to believe that. I'm giving you an opinion, but I think there's that dynamic going on here in the story we need to see. So Paul goes to Jerusalem, and he gave the collection to the leaders of the church. Again, this is the model of the temple there in first century Jerusalem. Now, when Paul gives the collection, the believers welcome it, the Jewish believers there welcome it, but they tell Paul kind of that things are a little bit more controversial than even he may have realized. The church in Jerusalem is under tremendous pressure from the rest of Judaism. This deal of welcoming Gentiles in has really become a hot spot. And they don't understand, James is telling Paul, they don't understand why you're telling these Gentiles that they can be a part of God's family if you're not circumcised, if you're not following the law. So you need to be careful, Paul, because this is a tense time, and you could set people off, and they just might, tear you apart for it. So here's what we ask you to do. James asks him to take and pay for the purification rites of 4 Jewish believers. This is to have their head shaved. They would have a time of purification, maybe as long as 30 days, and then at the end there would be a sacrifice that they would pay, that they would give at the temple to complete their purification. And so Paul does. He humbly agrees. And this is a really, really good part to see, a good thing to see in Paul. Because he doesn't press his rights. He could have said, I just brought you this collection. I just came to meet your needs. I don't need to prove anything else. I certainly don't need to go and participate in a purification rites because I'm not under the law any longer. But he doesn't do that. Instead, he sees how he can continue to work for peace in the church and continue to work to negotiate and to alleviate the tension that's there among the Jewish believers, Jewish Christ followers, and their Jewish neighbors there in Jerusalem. So he goes along with it without any complaint that we see. Now these are the southern steps of the Temple Mount. You can see them going up there. And over here, kind of to the side of the steps, they've found some, it's called mikvahs, or mikvot. These are baptismal pools. And the thought was, if you're going up to worship, you would go and submerge yourself in the pool before you go up to the temple. I showed a couple of pictures of those from Magdala. But these are there at the temple, and the most pious people would probably always immerse themselves before going up to the temple. Probably not everybody that does. There's a lot of commerce that goes up on the Temple Mount. Some government function that goes up here on the southern side. You see it's a little bit taller. Herod had built some governmental buildings there on the Temple Mount. So you're getting a sense of it's a very political situation here. But likely their purification would have included taking a dip in those mikvahs there before going up to the temple itself. Yeah.
Okay. I hadn't asked this before.
All right.
You brought it up a second time.
All right.
Okay, so they wear the robes and all this kind of stuff. Do they get in the robes and then just go sloshing into the temple? Or do they change into something and then put their robes back up?
I don't know. It's very likely they take off an outer layer and then dip themselves and come back up. The best place that might tell us that sort of detail would be the Dead Sea Scrolls and some of their documents. But again, they wouldn't be participating here at the temple. They're doing their thing out in the desert. I would venture a guess, and this is just based on the pragmatics of it. I would expect that for a lot of them, they would take off an outer layer and dip with just a single tunic. Remember, Jesus has the one piece woven from top to bottom. I think they would dip in that before putting their coat back on and going up. But that's a moderately informed guess. Good question. All right.
You know, that platform right there?
Yep.
It looks a lot like the Parliament building, where they have the tomb for the unknown soldier. It's
yeah.
built the same way.
That is interesting observation. Yeah, there's quite a lot of Greek and Roman architecture that in our state buildings we've continued to build in, because a lot of the ideals still can be traced back to the Greco-Roman time.
About in Athens,
Yeah.
in the Parliament building of Athens.
Okay.
On the outside, and they have the 2 guards at the tomb for the unknown soldier. They do the most ridiculous march you ever did see, in tunics,
Okay.
short ones.
Okay. I didn't realize that was the Athens tomb of the unknown soldier, but that would make a lot of sense because Herod's the one who's building up this platform. So when he takes over, he rebuilds the temple itself. He expands the Temple Mount, the big square that it's on, just about doubling the size of it. And then he builds, I think 3 of the 4 colonnades are rebuilt by Herod. And so that's going to be in a Greco-Roman style, in a Greek style. So yeah, that would not be surprising to me at all.
I think I gave you a picture of that.
Okay, I'll check it out.
I have a video of it.
Okay,
I have a video of it on that website. You'll like it.
okay, I'll check it out. Well, Paul goes on and he does the purification rites. And then while he's at the temple later, he's going up to do worship, just to be there to do worship and to teach and observe what's going on. Some of the people see Paul, and it says, this is in Acts 21:27, some of the Jews from the province of Asia, this is the area around Ephesus, they see Paul at the temple, and they stir up the crowd and they seize him, and they say, "Fellow Israelites, help us. This is the man who teaches everyone everywhere against our people and our law in this place." He's teaching them that now the people of God, the followers of Jesus, are now the temple of the living God because the Spirit has come. And then they level this charge at him and they say, "And besides, he has brought Greeks or Gentiles into the temple and defiled this holy place." They'd previously seen Trophimus the Ephesian in the city with Paul and assumed that Paul had brought him into the temple. That's the clarifying statement that they make there. So these Jews are from the area of Ephesus. They see Paul with this Ephesian Christ follower, and then they see Paul at the temple, and they say, "He probably brought that dude up here too." Here's why it's such a big deal. We found, this is a stone found at the Temple Mount from the 1st century. And it says in Greek, an inscription, "No foreigner may enter within the railing and enclosure surrounding the temple. Whoever is captured will have himself to blame for his subsequent death." They took this seriously. If you crossed the Gentile barrier, and the thought may be, and this is reconstructed because nothing from about this high remains anymore, but the thought is this line here may be about where that Gentile barrier was. But if a Gentile crossed that, he is defiling the temple. And they did not put up with it.
Are those like buildings in the background there? Are they houses? Or
Yeah. There's houses, kind of lower level houses here off to the left, the southwest. There's government buildings. One of these over here would be Herod's palace. And then, there's a theater and amphitheater. I think you can see the theater over here to the left side.
So this temple was no chicken coop.
No, this was the biggest temple in the world at that time. That's what everyone from outside, every Greek or Roman that came to Jerusalem, they were blown away by the Jewish temple because it was so unlike any others. They were used to seeing temples all over the place. Every city had temples, lots of them. Judaism had one temple, and it was massive. And it was the focal point of the city, even more so than the Dome of the Rock is there today. So, and it was a place of commerce. So, having it in a big square like this, Herod the Great basically made it kind of like the Jerusalem Forum. So there was business going on there too, as people are buying and selling to get ready to go make their sacrifices. That's part of what Jesus gets upset about, is because of the commerce that's being done as money's being exchanged and that sort of thing. So this is like the center point. This is the hot spot in Jerusalem. And the people are really upset at the idea of this. Verse 30 tells us that the whole city was aroused and the people came running from all directions. There's the southern steps, most people would come in, but there's also other gates on the backside where priests or where business people could come, like to do business here on the kind of the stoa. They could come in that way. So people are coming running in from all directions. Seizing Paul, they dragged him from the temple, and immediately the gates were shut. So the gates there at the front may be the ones that it's referring to. While they were trying to kill him, the news reached the commander of the Roman troops that the whole city of Jerusalem was in uproar. Remember, this is a big, big deal for Rome. They don't like mobs. They don't like things to get out of control because that's how you lose power. And so Jerusalem is just going crazy, and it's his job to go and to squash it. He at once took some soldiers and officers and soldiers and ran down to the crowd. Where is he? All right, you see this four-towered building right here next to the temple? That is the Antonia Fortress. That's where the Roman soldiers were stationed. That's where they had their garrison. And they would keep watch over the temple. In fact, during the Passover, they would stand on the tops of their buildings and they could look down into the temple to see where people were making their sacrifices, just as a way of intimidating the people, saying, you worship your God, but we're the ones who are really in power now. Right? Josephus tells of a time, and this is crazy, in 41 AD, while they're making the sacrifices of Passover, there was a Roman soldier up there, and he turns around to show his backside to them and makes a rude noise in their direction to mock them. It incites the people to a riot, and Josephus tells us 30,000 people were killed in the resulting violence. Okay, so political situation. This is a hot spot, right? So the soldiers are hearing all this stuff is going down, and we've got to come in and squash it. So they come from the Antonia Fortress in order to come into to grab Paul. And they grab him. When the soldiers get there, the rioters see him coming. They stop beating Paul, who knows how much they had done already. The commander came up and arrested him and ordered him to be bound with 2 chains. And then he asked who he was and what he had done. People in the crowd start answering. They shout in one thing, then another. Chaos starts to erupt again. So the commander says he can't hear what's going on. He can't get to the truth. He orders that Paul be taken back into the barracks, up into the fortress. And as they're going up, the crowd is screaming, "Get rid of him!" The soldiers are about to take Paul in, and he asks the commander, "May I say something to you?" Very polite for just having been beaten. The commander says, "Oh, you speak Greek. Aren't you an Egyptian?" Remember, if Paul has had his head shaved and he's dark complected, he might not be able to tell that he's Jewish. The guy says, "Aren't you the Egyptian who started a revolt? Aren't you that troublemaker?" Troublemakers were not in short supply in Jerusalem. And Paul says, "No, I'm a Jew from Tarsus in Cilicia, and I'm a citizen, of no ordinary city. That's a well-known city. I have some chops here. Let me speak to the people." So Paul stood on the steps, and there's some steps going up there. Maybe on the backside, we're not real sure which set of steps it was. Maybe out the backside, just off from the temple. And he begins to speak to him in Aramaic, which may have irritated the commander. So we don't know how much Aramaic he knew. Paul had just been talking to him in Greek, but he's speaking in the language of the people. And he tells his story. And he tells about how he was a persecutor. He said, I was just as zealous for God as any of you are today. I persecuted the followers of the way to their death, arresting both men and women and throwing them into prison, as the high priest and all the council themselves can testify. And he says, I went down to Damascus to grab more of them. And he tells about how he saw the light and asked, who is it? And he said, I am Jesus of Nazareth, whom you are persecuting. And he said, what shall I do? And the Lord said, get up and go to Damascus. There you'll be told all that you've been assigned to do. And he's led by the hand. Ananias comes and tells him about, you'll receive your sight. And at that moment, he was able to see. And then he said, the God of our ancestors has chosen you to know his will and to see the righteous one, Jesus, to hear words from his mouth. You will be his witness to all people of what you have seen and heard. Now what are you waiting for? Get up, be baptized, and wash your sins away, calling on his name. Paul said, then when I returned to Jerusalem and was praying at the temple, I fell into a trance and saw the Lord speaking to me. Quick, he said, leave Jerusalem immediately, because the people here will not accept your testimony about me. And then Paul replied, Lord, these people know that I went from synagogue to another to imprison and beat those who believe in you. And when the blood of your martyr Stephen was shed, I stood there giving my approval and guarding the clothes of those who were killing him. And then the Lord said to me, go, I will send you far away to the Gentiles. Boom, boom, boom. And the people go crazy. That was the one thing he shouldn't have said, at least in their mind. God cares about the Gentiles? No! And they start rioting again. Verse 22 said the crowd listened to Paul until he said this. And then they raised their voices and shouted, rid the earth of him. He's not fit to live. And it's pretty awesome. I love how Luke describes it. They're shouting and throwing off their cloaks and flinging dust into the air. And the commander's sitting there hearing this. It's been in another language. He may not know what all's going on. He just knows Paul said the wrong thing. And so he says, get him out of here. They take him up to the barracks. They're getting ready to flog him. He's about to be flogged. And then he tells them that he's a Roman citizen. He says, is this legal? I'm a citizen. I don't think you can do this. The guy goes, finds his commander, says he's a citizen. They ask Paul about it. And the commander says, I had to pay a lot of money for my citizenship. That was, something you could do if you were a respected soldier. You would have the opportunity to purchase your citizenship. Paul, on the other hand, responds, I was born a Roman citizen. And they withdrew immediately because that has quite a bit of weight. He's not just a new citizen, not just purchased. He comes from an esteemed family. And so they back off, recognizing that they were about to perpetuate a crime that would have gotten them in serious trouble. So they have this issue with Paul. They're trying to figure out what to do with him and what's he done. Well, they call him in. They bring him before the Sanhedrin. This is the Jewish ruling council of 70 leaders. It's made up of Pharisees and Sadducees. They ask what's going on. Paul steps in. First thing, he says, I've done everything to fulfill my duty in good conscience. The high priest orders that he be hit on the mouth for that. Paul kind of blows his top and says, God's going to strike you, you whitewashed wall. They say, how dare you insult the high priest? Paul goes on, he sizes up the situation at this point. And 23, verse 6, knowing that some of them were Sadducees and others Pharisees, he called out in the Sanhedrin, my brothers, I am a Pharisee, descended from Pharisees. I stand on trial because of the hope of the resurrection of the dead. And when he said this, a dispute broke out among the Pharisees and Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. All right, so he basically, imagine going into our Congress, the United States Congress today, and they bring you in and say, well, you're in trouble. You say, what have I done? I'm just here because I believe in small government. And half the group says, yes, that's great. And the other half says he should die. I mean, it's that sort of political thing where Paul is saying, I'm just here because I believe in the resurrection, that's all. And the Pharisees are like, there's nothing wrong with that. The Sadducees go crazy. So, that is what he is doing. It is that sort of politically charged, just tense, volatile situation. And Paul is speaking into it. And again, it goes just bonkers. And the soldiers have to come again and take him away. And that night, the Lord tells Paul to be encouraged. You've testified about me here in Jerusalem. You're going to testify about me in Rome as well. Now, Paul is then taken to Caesarea. See, there was a conspiracy. 40 Jews conspired to kill Paul. And when the commander hears about it, he says, we got to get Paul out of Jerusalem. This is not a good place. We're not going to have a fair trial. Justice will not be done, and he might get us in trouble if things go badly. So they take Paul to Caesarea Maritima. This is where the governor of Judea lived, where he resided. He would come over to Jerusalem for big occasions like the feast and stuff. Pilate does this. But the proconsul or the prefect, depending on the time, he spends his time here. This is where he governs from. And it's a nice place. You can see kind of the ocean view. Here's the remains of, if you see the kind of square outline, that was his pool. They're right on the ocean. Caesarea had a manufactured harbor. They'd found a way to make a concrete that hardened underwater. And so that's how they were able to manufacture this harbor, which made it a great place for shipping and brought a lot of wealth to the place. Here's the aqueduct that brought them water. And this is looking down into the aqueduct from the top. You can see the channel where the water would go through. It's pretty deep, about a little bit above my knee. You're not supposed to be able to get that picture, but some things you just don't know until after you've done them. So, works out. All right. While Paul is there, he's transferred under Governor Felix's care. Governor Felix used to be a slave, and he's not liked, and he's not an efficient governor. But Paul goes and speaks to him, and he holds Paul for 2 years, calling him up often to talk about Jesus. Eventually he's replaced because he was not effective. But in order that he might have maybe a good report from the Jews, he might have some friends he can appeal to from Rome, he leaves Paul in prison so that he goes and has to, meet with his boss in Rome, the emperor. He can say, well, ask him about me. I really wasn't that bad. Festus comes to power, takes his place. And then Festus tries to figure out what's going on with this guy, Paul. He speaks to the Jewish people. They again, are trying to have Paul killed. They want to have Paul sent back to Jerusalem in order that they can assassinate him on the way. While in the meeting, probably in this very hall, we think this is the meeting hall there at the Caesarea Palace, Festus asked Paul, well, are you willing, would you like to go back to Jerusalem for trial? And Paul has the opening and he takes it. He says, no, I'm a Roman citizen. I will appeal to Caesar. And as a Roman citizen, that's his guaranteed ticket. He's got to go to Rome. And this was a little bit of an older picture here, but I had to reenact that moment myself. I appeal to Rome, appeal to Caesar. And so this is where we're going to see Paul's trip as he goes to Rome. And we got a little bit off on time. Next week, I'm going to go ahead and just cover the trip to Rome with some of the other theory from what may happen. There's a theoretical fourth missionary journey that's alluded to. We'll talk about that when we wrap up next week. But do we have any questions?
Paul was arrested in Jerusalem and says, I'm a Roman citizen. Why would the Romans hand him back over to the Jews for an apparent trial? Now, again, Paul was pretty bright, divide and conquer, between the Sadducees and Pharisees. But I was curious why they would even allow him to go back to the stand trial, basically.
Part of it, a big part of it, is they're trying to figure out what it is that he's done. Why is it that everybody had this uproar? So they're working together with the Jewish people in order to govern. Everything works better if they can kind of partner in the government. I mean, it's a contentious partnership, yes, but ultimately, if they don't keep the Jewish people somewhat happy, there could be a revolt. So you have that constant. If you want to think of it, they're living between they're on a highway between two ditches where you don't want to have Rome assert themselves too harsh where the Jewish people revolt. You don't want to have the Jewish people, cause too much trouble where Rome has to come in and put the hammer down. So they're constantly trying to gauge that, and having Paul go before them just to figure out what's going on and figure out what punishment is appropriate for him would be helpful. It also could help them get a better sense. What are the nuances? When you walk into an argument and you don't know what's going on, sometimes knowing what the argument is will help you later. Especially, if you're a manager and you've got an employee argument, it's not always just about knowing who's right and who's wrong. You want to kind of know the details so that you won't be blindsided later. And I think that's that could be part of the motive for taking him back to the Sanhedrin.
So Paul was both Jewish and Roman. Was that like a mixed marriage type thing, or how did that work?
He was ethnically Jewish, and he had a Roman citizenship. We have no idea how that came about. We know that his father, if he was born a citizen, at least his father was a citizen. It could be that his father had served in the military. It could be that as a part of some venture he was in on, Rome had given citizenship to not just his father, but a collection. Maybe if he's in the military, it could be, hey, your whole legion is granted citizenship. It could be that because of his connection there. Remember the guy on Cyprus we saw, the Sergius Paulus, who was proconsul there? That's the same last name, Paul, that Paul has. It could be that there was some connection there, that he worked with that proconsul. That's where they pick up the name Paulus, and at the same time they also are given the Roman citizenship. That's real wild speculation. We just guess on some of that.
Well, did they have the Olympics yet?
Yeah.
Olympic competitors were treated as super high special people, and I think they were given citizenship. So it could be like his father or somebody like that, because he was born with the citizenship.
Mhm.
Paul was.
It could. The thing is, we're talking about a Roman citizenship.
Yeah.
So Greece wouldn't have the power to give a Roman citizenship.
Yeah.
They were
Yeah.
they were under the empire as well.
Yeah, right.
So, but yeah, there's several ways. Probably as wide as our imagination could be. Sandra.
Okay, I'm a little fascinated by Felix here.
Okay.
In Acts 24 through 27, they're having some sort of get-together where Felix comes with his wife Drusilla, and down in 25 it says, Felix became frightened and said, "Go away for the present. When I find time, I will summon you." And then the next scripture says, at the same time, too, he was hoping that money would be given him by Paul. So does that kind of come from his coming from the slave or servant background? And, I mean, was he expecting, eventually, you said that he had many, many meetings with Paul, and
Yeah.
did he kind of secretly have a handout the whole time, hoping
Yeah.
he was gonna?
I don't think it had. I mean, maybe he's certainly a product of his formation, his formative years. But that's also just the way things were done in that world. Bribes just grease the wheels, make things happen. So, yeah, he may have seen that, Paul has, especially if Paul's needs are being met by believers at this time, which may very well be true, he's seeing that Paul has a community of people behind him, if that's the case. So maybe this guy, he's got citizenship, he seems to have a good education, maybe there's some influence there, maybe there's some financial backing that someone's going to want Paul back and might throw in a bribe just to help him out. I don't know that a former slave would be any more prone to that than anybody else. It seems to be pretty typical of how things worked then. But yeah, Felix, he had reason to be wary of his own well-being. So maybe he was a little bit more careful about that, a little bit more proactive about trying to secure his future.
So do we know what happened to Felix after Festus came on the scene?
He had to go back to Rome and gave an account there. I don't know that I've heard what happened to him, but I will look it up.
Thank you.
Yeah.
It would be interesting to see if he merged into a different position in Rome, or if he went back to being a slave.
You never know. All right. Good. Other questions?
Just to clear, just to
Yep.
make sure. Paul was a Jew,
Yes.
but he had a Roman citizenship.
Yes.
Okay.
So citizenship, you could be granted citizenship no matter what your ethnicity, what your background was. Now it wasn't common. I mean, it's a rare thing. It's a big deal. That's why they don't even think to ask Paul if he's a citizen. They just assume he's not. You could be in the Roman army and not a citizen. It was very common. So being a Roman citizenship was a special privilege. It's not like most of us. If you grew up in the United States, you take citizenship really for granted. But for them, not.
Like, I was born in Jamaica.
Yeah.
And I have a Jamaican citizenship.
Yeah.
But I also have an American one.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly. That's a real good comparison.
So certain places I go in just the Jamaican one, and, yeah, you're right, certain places I just have the American one.
Yeah.
I have both.
You're always you would always identify as a Jamaican,
Yes, everywhere.
but you're also a Roman citizen. And that would be, you're also an American citizen, not Roman.
I know.
If you are, that'd be really
Yeah,
cool.
because I'm
Okay.
Anyway, I was there, and that was a little problem with them, because when I went to the Philippines, I taught there for 2 years in the high
Okay.
school, and immigration and all that stuff, they really gave me a hard time because they did not want me to use the American citizen.
I
Because
gotcha.
you're not an American.
Yeah.
You know, even though I have that American citizenship, it was just like a big, so I had to give them the Jamaican one. And that's how they see me over there. I was a Jamaican, and that's it.
That's good. That kind of flexibility really probably helps us get an insight into how Paul works, because he's Jewish and he's also a Roman citizen, and he's also educated in kind of at least a somewhat Greek way. So remember, we talked about those 3 worlds, and we see Paul kind of navigating through those different worlds, and that really kind of is a good illustration for how Paul lived and worked as he's carrying out his ministry. Yeah. Couple of things. I like recommending books. This is not Paul specific, but if you like this sort of background stuff on the Bible, a really, really great place to start is the IVP Bible Background Commentary. This is for the New Testament. They've got one on the Old Testament as well, but this goes through the entire New Testament. And it's just a little paragraphs. So just a paragraph on, here's John 8:23, and then a paragraph on 8:24 through 25, and a smaller one. So there's just varying little nuggets, but it gives a lot of meaty insight for there's a lot of bang for your buck. I would tell anybody who's teaching, if you're wanting to add something that'll really help you, that'll be a go-to resource every week, this is it. I've got a lot of books. I've got a lot of background materials and commentaries, and I have access to all of Bobby's. I still, for the last however many weeks I've been preaching, this is where I start every week. It's that useful.
What was the name again? I'm sorry.
The IVP Bible Background Commentary.
Thank you.
I want to say this runs about $35 or $40, but it's super. Another one, and this is the only time I'll have something for purchase, but this, some of y'all remember that my doctoral cohort, wrote a collection of essays on conflict management in the Apostle Paul. We look at several different conflicts in Paul's life. You can get this on Amazon. What we've done here at the church, though, is I've ordered them at my discount price. I get it for $12.50, and then we sell it for $20, and the proceeds go to our missions fund. If you'd like to purchase that, I've got a few copies here, and we can order a bunch more. But anyway, you can feel free. We do, we've got a few things that if I can squeeze in what I need to next week, I'll show some slides that kind of summarize some stuff there. But
Which Josephus book were you using?
I was using the Complete Works, the Complete Works of Josephus, translated by William Whiston.
What does it look like?
Looks like that. And this, I think I got this for about $16 or $17. So if you like Josephus, this is great. But again, if you just want to kind of dive in, there's a lot of Josephus stuff you can find online for free.
So you keep mentioning that the Romans really strive to keep conflict down.
Yes.
What conflicts had they encountered that made them this way?
Well, for one, you had the whole Julius Caesar thing. So they'd been a Roman, the Republic. Julius Caesar had, I forget the exact title. He was like steward of the city or something like that. He wasn't an emperor, but there was the idea that he was becoming that way. And so he was assassinated. They had a 10-year battle between Mark Antony and Octavian, or also he became Augustus. They had a 10-year war between those two before Augustus solidified his empire. So I mean, that was a big ongoing battle. But what they're trying to do is and I don't know specific examples on this, but they're trying to knock down things like what you saw with the Arab Spring back in 2010. These, grassroots kind of uprising that ends up leading to regime change. That happened a lot in the world then. And whether it's just one town throwing out their local magistrate, that's one thing. It doesn't seem like that would be a big deal to Rome, but it disturbs order.
Would Spartacus have played a big part in that, or?
I don't know. I don't know enough to say either way on that.
Was he real?
Spartacus? I don't even know. that's that's a good question.
There's a lot of.
He's not first century, so I don't care. So he was not in my reading, so he might as well be fake. We'll say that. All right. Thank you so much. Next week we will wrap this up. I do have the note sheets from lesson 3 and 4 over there, and I've got the completed note sheet from 5, which we did not complete today. We'll adjust it for next week, and you'll finish everything next week.
So we're going to use the same notes for next week?
We'll use part of them, yes.
Okay.
Well,